going to be in 2 Kings just for a little bit tonight. And then more of 2 Chronicles. We are going to be looking at the best king since David. That's how he's described. An amazing king of Israel that just happens to be the son of a scoundrel and the father of a scoundrel as well. He is put right in between a bad dad and a bad kid. So we're going to look at Hezekiah tonight and next week as well. Now I got me coughing. All right, so new king in town. Ahaz, his dad, 2 Kings 18. For just a little bit. And then we're going to be in 2 Chronicles 29, 30, and 31. I've got a couple of cough drops. The devil does not want us to talk about this tonight. We're going to talk about one of the greatest revivals in the Bible. So, we've got the son of Ahaz, probably the wickedest one going. Hezekiah is in the middle of the roller coaster of all these kings. Started, Solomon had a boy, Rehoboam. Remember Rehoboam? He was the one that he listened to the counsel of his younger folks rather than the older ones that had been around his dad, who was the wisest guy going. And when the tribes from the north came and they asked how he was going to treat them, he said, I'm going to treat you worse than my dad. If he was like this, I'm going to be like a scorpion. So he's the one that caused the division. And so he was a bad king right after Solomon. And then Abijah, his son, was a bad king also, only lasted 3 years. Asa came along, he was a good one. Then Jehoshaphat came along, and he was a good one. And then Jehoram, and he was a bad one. And then if that wasn't bad enough, Jehoram's mama came along, Athaliah, the grandmother who wiped out the royal seed, all except for one, and she reigned for about 7 years, I think. And her grandson was presented, Joash, at age 7, and he was a good one, but then he kind of went bad toward the end. He ended up killing. Remember, he was good because he had the counsel of the high priest. And then after that high priest died at a very old age, in his hundreds, his son Zechariah came and gave some counsel or prophecy to Joash, and Joash didn't like it and had him killed. Then his son Amaziah, bad. Amaziah's son Uzziah was good. He was a good one, lasted 52 years. Ended up with leprosy, but he was good. His son Jotham, he was good. And then Jotham, after a good grandfather and a good father, had Ahaz, who was really, really bad. It's kind of interesting that the prophecy of the Messiah to be born, that a virgin shall be with child and bear a son, his name shall be called Emmanuel, God with us, was given to one of the worst kings of Judah. And then Ahaz, his son, was Hezekiah. Really, really good king. But then he has Manasseh, bad son, who actually kind of turns around at the end, and then he gives birth to Ammon, bad king. Didn't last long, but then Ammon gives birth to one of my favorite kings. You know who that is? Josiah. And then there's a few other sprinklings before they go into the Babylonian captivity. But Josiah, if you remember, and we're going to look at it next week, but Hezekiah was such a good king that he was granted 15 extra years of life. I know, and he had a bad son during that time, who ended up being the grandfather of one of the greatest kings, Josiah. So it kind of evened out. All right, last week we looked at the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. They were finally conquered. They were carried away by Assyria. Now, coinciding with what is happening, you have the ministries of Isaiah and Hosea. And Hezekiah is kind of like Hosea. You remember Hosea? He had the wife Gomer. And the Gomer was a harlot and went off into harlotry. And then God told him to go back and find Gomer, who had these children whose names were something like, "You're not mine," "No, you're not mine," "You're not mine," to bring her back in. And Gomer was kind of like Israel. Israel was in harlotry. It had the spirit of harlotry, it's going to say here in a little bit. But Hezekiah is going to go to them and invite the remnant, the remaining ones who were not carried away and dispersed by the Assyrians, invite them back into fellowship with the southern kingdom. So he's kind of going to live out what is being taught and prophesied at the same time that he is alive by the prophet Hosea. All right, but Hezekiah also witnessed the fall of the northern kingdom. That'll sober you up. That'll get you serious about God when you see an entire nation that you have been, for hundreds of years going back and forth with, suddenly taken away. And the Assyrians didn't stop there. They had their eye on Judah as well. And so that'll make you kind of serious when you are under the gun, and yet he had a heart that was wired toward God. He had watched a terrible father. And so now he was ready to lead an amazing revival. So anyway, we're here in 2 Kings chapter 18. I want to start with verses 9 and 11, because this is his life in reign is just a few years after Israel fell to Assyria, and that's what it talks about here. So 2 Kings 18:9. In the 4th year of Hezekiah's reign, which was the 7th year of the reign of Hoshea, the son of Elah, over Israel, he's the one that's going to be king when Assyrians take him, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, marched against Samaria and besieged it. That happened. They did it for 3 years. Starve them out. At the end of 3 years, the Assyrians captured it. So Samaria was captured in the 6th year of Hezekiah. So for 6 years, he had Israel above him. And then he watched in his 6th year of his reign, Israel being taken away, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. The king of Assyria exiled the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Halan, Gozan, and by the Habor River and in the cities of the Medes. That's what they would do. They would take the population, remove them, and then put them in all these different places where they had conquered. They just start mixing people around. But they didn't catch everybody. There were some who escaped them, and there were some who were not significant enough for them to mess with. And we're going to see them in chapter 30. So, back to verse 1. 2 Kings 18, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Hoshea, the son of Elah, over Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, became king of Judah. He was 25 years old. You got any 25-year-olds you want to be king over America? And he became king and reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, which is interesting. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David has done. That you finally get a good description of a guy. He did what was right in the sight of God, but then that little extra is put on there. Just like David. David is this standard. There were some who did good, but not so much in the way of David. Finally, you got a guy that's doing good in God's sight, but also equivalent with a man after God's own heart, which is David. So he is at a whole different level. And then here's something that takes him up to that higher level as well. He removed the high places. Remember, good guys would come and go, bad, good, but they never dealt with those high places. Finally, you have a king who's not just talk. We have all these politicians who say, I'm against abortion, I'm for abortion, but nobody ever does anything about it. This is like a politician finally getting in office and saying, we're going right after abortion, first thing. And we're going to get it removed. Not just talk about how we're against it, or if it was me. Remember what Geraldine Ferraro said, I'm against it, but, I wouldn't have one myself, but, if somebody else wants to do that. going to get rid of it. Get rid of the high places. Shattered the sacred pillars, cut down the Asherah poles, and he also demolished, and this is what it says in 2 Kings, it doesn't say in 2 Chronicles, he demolished the bronze snake called Nehushtan that Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had burned incense to it. He removed all these sacred places. But when he became king, these sacred places are up there because when he became king, there was no temple. And we're going to see that in a little bit. There was no operating temple. And so the people were going to all these different types of worship, and high place was one of those things. But here he demolished the bronze snake, which Moses had made. If you remember back in Numbers 21, when the people had just come from a great victory. I was reading this in my reading this 2 days ago. They had just come from a big thing. God had given them a victory, but then they didn't have enough food and water, and they were tired of the manna. They started to grumble. You know something God doesn't like? The Baptists are great at? Grumbling. God said, I don't like grumbling. I'm going to send you some snakes. You want to grumble? What if in a business meeting when everybody was grumbling, God set a few snakes on us? We'd probably get our attention at that point. And that's what he did. And the snakes came in among them and began to bite them. And many began to die because they were poisonous snakes. Moses cried out to God. And God said, make a bronze serpent on a pole. And tell the people to come and look at it. And the ones who look at it will be healed. The ones who don't, good luck with that poison. But the ones who had the faith to look at it, as strange as it seemed, those are the ones that would be healed. Now, Jesus used this very illustration, moment that God did this, to point Nicodemus to the cross. Remember John 3:16, that most famous verse in the world, out of the Bible. It is in the midst of Jesus pointing Nicodemus to look to, just like the serpent in the wilderness, Moses pointed the people to look at that. For when the Messiah is lifted up, when you look in faith to the Messiah, that will be the point where forgiveness, as crazy as it might seem, that a man on a cross is going to save my life for eternity, that if I look in faith, and many people will say that's crazy, and they'll refuse to do it. But if I look in simple faith, and Nicodemus, great teacher of Israel, that doesn't make sense. If you will look in faith, because you must be born again. And so here you have this bronze pole that had that history to it. And for hundreds of years, the people had taken that bronze pole and started to worship it. And they were burning incense to it. And we think that's kind of crazy, but we have our little relics. I mean, if you look in the Catholicism, they've got all these different relics that they set up and kind of offer different types of worship and respect and honor to. And many of us, we have this little thing that we call the cross. And a lot of people, they will wear that cross, kiss that cross. And they will treat that cross as almost a reverent thing to worship. And even if that was the actual cross that Jesus died on that we would have possession of, it still wouldn't warrant taking our attention away from God as a form of worship. And this pole was doing exactly that. You know, the cross, if people really realize what the cross was, now if you had a little necklace on and you had a little noose at the end of it, guillotine, electric chair, that's what the cross is. It was capital punishment. You know, Paul gloried in the cross, but I don't think he thought about wearing crosses, because that would have seemed crazy in their day to wear that capital punishment instrument. Well, verse 5, it says, Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, No king of Judah was like him, either before him or after him. He remained faithful to the Lord and did not turn from following him. He kept the commandments that the Lord had given Moses, and the Lord was with Hezekiah, and he prospered wherever he went. That's 2 Kings. That's it. That's all they give you. Greatest king, that's all you got to say? I'm glad we got 2 Chronicles, because 2 Kings does not even mention one of the greatest revivals in the Bible. It gives this abbreviated description that Hezekiah was faithful, but 2 Chronicles 29 begins to tell us about exactly what he did and how from the get-go, out of the starting blocks, he started to do amazing things. So 2 Chronicles chapter 29. Verses 1 and 2 are a repeat of his reign starting. And then verse 3, 2 Chronicles 29, it says, in the first month of the first year of his reign, Hezekiah opened and repaired the doors of the house of the Lord. He didn't wait long, not just in his first year, in his first month. That was his first thing. You know, they talk about the president in their first 100 days. This was in his first 30 days. He immediately started to fix the house of the Lord that for 16 years had not been open. Could you imagine having no church to go to for 16 years? That was what was happening under Ahaz, his father. And so the first thing he did, he opened and repaired the doors of the house of the Lord. Then he brought the priests and Levites, and he gathered them in the square on the east side. This way he said to them, listen to me, O Levites. Consecrate yourselves now, and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers. Remove from the holy place every impurity. For our fathers were unfaithful and did evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They abandoned him, turned their faces from the dwelling place of the Lord, and they turned their backs on him. They also shut the doors of the portico and extinguished the lamps. They did not burn, the lamp was never to go out. They extinguished it. They did not burn incense or present burnt offerings in the holy place of the God of Israel. No Day of Atonement, no Passover. They hadn't done anything. So Hezekiah brings the clergy out there in front of him, and he begins to give them the riot act. Tells them this is exactly why we are in the situation that we find ourselves. We're not going to be like our dads and our grandfathers. We're going to immediately change course 180. Verse 8. Therefore the wrath of the Lord has fallen upon Judah and Jerusalem. He's made them an object of terror, horror, and mockery, as you can see with your own eyes. For behold, this is why our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and daughters and wives are in captivity. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger will turn away from us. So he says, my sons, do not be negligent, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him, to serve him, to minister before him, and to burn incense. Then the Levites set to work. Hezekiah connects all of the problems, all of the defeats of the nation, to the nation's decision to turn away from God. He said, this is why. It's not because we didn't have a good military. It's because we chose to turn away from God. And we saw a radical change in 62 and 63 in America when we made the decision to take the Bible and prayer and remove them from public life and from schools. Then we kind of took it up another notch in 73 and legalized abortion. And parallel, you've been seeing these decisions with moral and cultural decline. And nobody has the guts to stand up and say, you know what the real problem is? We turned our face away from God. This is exactly what we get. And the only solution is not to throw money at this and money at that and money at that. It's to turn back to God. to figure out what we need to do to get back in compliance to God, and then do it. And let everything else follow behind that. Well, verse 15 says that when they had assembled their brothers and consecrated themselves, they went in to cleanse the house of the Lord according to the commandments of the king by the words of the Lord. So the priests went inside the house of the Lord to cleanse it. They brought out to the courtyard all the unclean things that they found in the temple of the Lord. Then the Levites took these things and carried them out to the Kidron Valley. They weren't even allowed to remove garbage from the house of God until they consecrated themselves. And then when they began to go in there and clean it out, the priests were in there just getting garbage and impure things in all directions, brought them out to the courtyard, and the Levites loaded them up. They had this whole process going. Took it to the Kidron Valley and dumped it. Cleansing the house of the Lord. So much garbage that it says they began to consecrate on the first day of the first month. He started this day 1. And on the 8th day of the month, they reached the portico of the Lord. It took them 8 days to get to the porch. For 8 more days, they consecrated the house of the Lord itself, finishing on the 16th day of the first month. It took them 8 days just to get to the door. Then 8 days to get the inside cleaned out. 16 days it took them to clean out this place. You know, we're God's temple. We got a lot of rubbish in us. It's all going to start with our walk with God, getting rid of some rubbish. It may take 16 days. It may take 8 days just to get to between the ears. But we got the rubbish that needs to be cleaned out if we're going to move forward with God and have His temple usable, us, usable to God. In verse 18 it said they went to the king Hezekiah and they reported, "We've cleansed the entire house of the Lord, the altar of burnt offering with all of its utensils, and the table of the showbread with all of its utensils. Moreover, we prepared and consecrated all the articles that King Ahaz, in his unfaithfulness, cast aside during his reign. They are now in front of the altar of the Lord." Temple's ready to go, King. What's next? Well, we'll wait a while, a week or so. Verse 20, early the next morning, King Hezekiah gathered the city officials, went up to the house of the Lord. They brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, 7 male goats as a sin offering for the kingdom. Issue number 1 is our sin. We're going to christen that temple by getting a sin offering done. We're not going to go up there and have a party and a happy service and all that. We're going to start with the problem, which is our sin. And the king commanded the priests, the descendants of Aaron, to offer them on the altar of the Lord. So they slaughtered the bulls, and the priests took the blood, sprinkled it on the altar. They slaughtered the rams, sprinkled the blood on the altar. They slaughtered the lambs and sprinkled the blood on the altar. Then verse 23 says they brought the goats for the sin offering before the king and the assembly, who laid their hands on them. Remember the scapegoat and all that? And the priests slaughtered the goats and put their blood on the altar for a sin offering. One of them got, and the other one got scapegoated, to make atonement for all Israel, because the king had ordered the burnt offering and the sin offering for all of Israel. So number 1, we're going to deal with sin. And then you kind of see the next thing that he does after dealing with sin, all the very serious things, that he's got a flair for a big production. He didn't want anybody to forget this day. Hezekiah, verse 25, stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres, according to the command of David, of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, For the command had come from the Lord through his prophets that the Levites stood with the instruments of David and the priests with the trumpets. So the Levites got their little band going, and then over there the priests got their trumpets. Hezekiah ordered that the burnt offering be sacrificed on the altar, and when the offering began, the song of the Lord and the trumpets began as well. So while all this burnt offering is being offered, got all this music that starts up, accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. The whole assembly was worshiping. The singers were singing. The trumpeters were playing. All this continued until the burnt offering was completed. You got this sacrifice in this temple that's finally operational. And you got the sin offering done, very solemn, very serious. And now the burnt offerings are happening, coinciding with worship all around. When the offerings were completed, the king and all those present with him bowed down and worshipped. After all the offerings, the king now leads everybody in visible worship as he bows at the altar. Wouldn't you love to see Trump at an altar of a church, not just showing up at a church, but at the altar, on his knees, saying, America, this is what we need. Let me lead us in doing what we need to do. So he and those present with him bowed in worship. Then King Hezekiah and his officials ordered the Levites to sing praises to the Lord in the words of David and of Asaph the seer. So they sang praises with gladness and bowed their heads and worshiped God. What do you do now? You got the sin offering, you got the burnt offering with all this wonderful music, and then you got everybody bowing before the Lord. Got to take an offering. Can't leave without an offering. Then Hezekiah said, this is verse 31 through 34, now that you have consecrated yourselves to the Lord, come near and bring sacrifices and thank offerings to the house of the Lord. So the assembly brought sacrifices and thank offerings, and all whose hearts were willing brought burnt offerings. The number of burnt offerings the assembly brought was 70 bulls, 100 rams, and 200 lambs. All these were for a burnt offering to the Lord. And the consecrated offerings were 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep. Those whose hearts were willing to give. Their hearts had now been prepared to give. You know, we have music, we have praise music, and we do it so that it'll prepare everybody for the sermon. They did it to prepare everybody for the offering. What if we had great praise music, worship music? Okay, now we're ready. Our hearts are prepared. We're willing. Now let's have an offering. Instead of having it when everybody's just, okay, wake up. This is important. Oh, offering, okay. Don't even know what's happening until it's happening. But here you have him preparing everybody, and the offering that was given was so large that the Levites had to step in and help the priests. It says, since there was not enough priests to skin all the burnt offerings, the Levite brothers helped them until the work was finished and until the priests had been consecrated. For the Levites had been more diligent in consecrating themselves than the priests had been. Furthermore, verse 35, the burnt offerings were abundant, along with the fat of the peace offerings and the drink offerings for the burnt offerings. Abundant. Wouldn't you love to say the offering was abundant today? People's hearts were willing. People worshiped, and then they gave, and giving is worship. And they worshiped as hard in giving as they worshiped when they were in the midst of the music. This is a revival by any Baptist standards. I read about a church treasurer who resigned the church, and the local grain elevator operator, manager, was asked to take the position. He agreed under two conditions. No treasurer's report would be given for the first year, and that no questions be asked about the finances during that year. By surprise, but they agreed to do it because they trusted him. And at the end of the year, he gave his report. The church indebtedness of $228,000 had been paid. The minister's salary had been increased by 8%. The Cooperative program gifts have been paid 200%. There were no outstanding bills, and there was a cash balance of $11,252. Well, they were shocked, and they asked, where did this money come from? And he said, well, most of you bring your grain to my elevator. Throughout the year, I simply withheld 10% on your behalf and gave it to the church in your name. You didn't even miss it. He said, do you see what we can do for the Lord if we were all willing to give at least a tithe to the Lord? And they were willing. And because they were willing, it was abundant. And they had to get other people to help carry the load. The Levites had to help the priests. So the service of the house of the Lord was established, and Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced at what God had prepared for the people, because everything had been accomplished so quickly. Boys, it just greases the wheel, greases everything, primes the pump when our hearts are right before the Lord. Everything accomplished so quickly and in abundance. Now, chapter 30, we'll look at that real quick. Hezekiah reinstates the Passover. It's been over 200 years. No Passover. The kingdoms got separated back under Jeroboam and Rehoboam right after Solomon. And you know up in the north, they had the separate type of worship. They didn't even have the temple. They had the calves that were in two different places. And Jeroboam created a whole different priesthood and a whole different way of worshiping. So here you have the Passover being reinstated. And it says that Hezekiah sent word throughout all Israel and Judah. And he wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh. That's Israel. That's the northern kingdom. Inviting them to come to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem to keep the Passover of the Lord, the God of Israel. So here starts the Passover, but what do you need when you have the Passover? You need your people back together. The breach healed. And so he sends letters to the northern kingdom, to those who have escaped being taken away. The king and his officials and the whole assembly in Jerusalem had decided to keep the Passover in the second month. It's supposed to be in the first month, 14th day. But it took them 16 days in the first month to clean the temple. Then they had all of this worship and everything. And so they decided that they would do it second month, 14th day. Instead, assuming that after 200 years, God would not be upset if they just got it a month off. So they had been unable to observe it at the regular time because not enough priests had consecrated themselves. It's a big process. And the people had not been gathered in Jerusalem. This proposal pleased the king and the whole assembly, so they established a decree to circulate a proclamation throughout Israel from Beersheba to Dan. That's the top to the bottom. Those were the ways that the nation was described, the most northern and the most southern points. And that the people should come to keep the Passover of the Lord, the God of Israel, in Jerusalem. For they had not observed it as a nation had prescribed, as prescribed. So it did not happen. Long, long time. Hezekiah said, we're not going to wait a year to do this. We're going to do it next month. So the couriers went throughout Israel and Judah with letters from the king. This is what it said. This shows you his heart, because he gets honest about why we're in the predicament again. Children of Israel, return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He didn't call him Jacob, because Jacob might be divisive. Israel, the new name that he was given after he wrestled with that angel. So that he may return to those of you who remain, who have escaped the grasp of the king of Assyria. Do not be like your fathers, so that he made them an object of horror, as you can see. Do not stiffen your necks, as your fathers did. Submit to the Lord. Come to his sanctuary, which he has consecrated forever. He writes them, don't be like your dad. Your dads got punished. They got judged. They got carried away. You need to not stiffen your neck. You ever try to talk to somebody whose neck is stiff and they won't look at you? That's the way Israel was with God. He said, loosen your neck. Be pliable. Look to God. Dig up the fallow ground. And then submit to the Lord. Come to the sanctuary, which he consecrated forever. This is the place where we meet with him. Serve the Lord your God, so that his fierce anger will turn away from you. For if you return to the Lord, your brothers and sons will receive mercy in the presence of their captors and will return to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful. He will not turn his face away from you if you return to him. So this will stop God's anger. This will help your brothers and your sons, that they will receive mercy from their captors. It's going to affect how God allows those who are their captors to behave toward them, and then they have more of a chance to return. And then God, if you turn to him, he's not going to turn away from you. He's going to be like that prodigal dad when you come. Couriers traveled city to city in the land of Ephraim and Manasseh as far as Zebulun. Look at this. But the people scorned and mocked them. Nevertheless, some from Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Israel. Mocked. You ever go door to door witnessing? You hit this door and they'll be receptive. You hit this door and you get mocked. You know, they were getting all these different reactions. Some were receiving them or humbling themselves and came. But some mocked and scorned them. Moreover, the power of God was on the people in Judah to give them one heart to obey the command of the king and his officials according to the word of God. You can tell when God is truly at work when you got that united spirit that's working. And Satan works overtime to try to bring division in a church. Because he knows when God is really at work, that the sign of that will be one heart. One heart. So Satan wants divided hearts, divided congregations. All right, verse 13. So in the second month, a very great assembly gathered in Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You know, that's you have the Passover day, and then you've got 7 days of unleavened bread feast. They proceeded to remove the altars in Jerusalem and to take away the incense altars and throw them in the Kidron Valley. And on the 14th day of the second month, they slaughtered the Passover lamb. That Passover lamb. Over 200 years since a Passover lamb had been slaughtered. The priests and the Levites were ashamed. And they consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings to the house of the Lord. They had not done this in all of their existence. This was the first Passover lamb that these priests and these Levites themselves, and it just hit them. This was their job. They had never done it. And they were ashamed. A large number of the people had not purified themselves. The ones from Ephraim and Israel and Manasseh, they came down. They didn't know anything about this. They'd never experienced it. They didn't know how to get themselves pure. Yet they ate the Passover contrary to what was written. Got all these requirements. When Lynn and I were in Thailand, we went into a Buddhist temple. They had all this list of stuff you had to do. You can't wear a tank top. A woman's arms her shoulders can't be seen. So you got to have sleeves. You had to cover your shoes or take them off. All these restrictions. If we put laws like that for people to walk into a church building, why do you do that? That's horrible. That's unloving. People are coming in droves and not even questioning it. Oh, they're respectful of their religion. We should be too. If somebody comes into a church and gets treated that way, Satan gets in hearts. He knows the religion to attack and the one to encourage. But all these different restrictions. Of course, in there you got to respect what's going on. You can't use loud. They couldn't go in there shouting. They'd throw you out. It's all about respect. Yet there was a group that hadn't been able to do that. And so what do you do with that group? Hezekiah let them eat the Passover, understanding that they didn't understand that much. And he interceded for them, saying, May the Lord, who is God, the Lord who is good, provide atonement for everyone who sets his heart on seeking God. The Lord, the God of the fathers, even if he is not cleansed according to the purification rules of the sanctuary. And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. Remember, Jesus' disciples were accused by the Pharisees of not eating with unclean hands. Not because they had disobeyed Scripture, but they had disobeyed the Pharisaical interpretations and requirements over and above the Word of God. And Jesus said, you by your traditions that you have removed the Word of God and its truth. You have your traditions are not the Word of God. And so he defended his disciples. Anyway, verse 21, the Israelites who were present in Jerusalem celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days with great joy. And the Levites and the priests praised the Lord day after day, accompanied by the loud instruments of praise to the Lord. They are having a good time. When you know people are having a good time? They don't want to go home. The whole assembly agreed to observe 7 more days. So they observed 7 days with joy. The feast is only 7 days long. Then you get to go home. They said, no, we're not going home. We're going to stay 7 more days. Imagine a church service so good that everybody says, we're not leaving. And I got people leaving before we even finish the invitation song. They're out and in the parking lot. And they're out of here as quick as they can. Just imagine, nobody moved. We're not going. In some churches in China, they have to pass the preacher over everybody's head because the congregation is not leaving the building. The preacher's got to be somewhere else to preach. And so he just gets on like these concerts, and everybody's hands goes up, and they put him out the back door because they're not leaving that building. They came there to worship, and they're not going to stop with just what he did. Well, the whole assembly of Judah rejoiced along with the priests and Levites and the whole assembly that had come from Israel. They're back together, including the foreigners who had come from Israel and those who had lived in Judah. Remember, they sprinkle in people from other nations when they conquer a place, not just take away yours, but they put in others. Some of them came. So there was great rejoicing in Jerusalem, for nothing like this had happened there since the days of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Then the priests and the Levites stood to bless the people, and God heard their voice, and the prayer came into his holy dwelling place in heaven. Hundreds of years, not since Solomon, had anything like this happened. And under Solomon, remember, it was the glory filled the temple, Shekinah glory, so much that you couldn't go in there. So here you have God doing such a work that the people are rejoicing, the leaders are praying, and God is hearing in his holy place in heaven, from his holy place in heaven. Man, that is 3 strikes you're in. That's great. 3 things happening. Wouldn't it be great if people were just rejoicing here, and leaders were praying for people, our deacons and our leaders, and everybody was praying, and God was hearing every detail from him. That's where they are now, led by Hezekiah. God was preparing a people that he could bless and protect, because the Assyrians, we're going to see next week, were not done. And if Judah was going to stay like Israel, then they would deserve to be conquered like Israel. But God was going to sustain a remnant. He was going to sustain a people. And they would go, in about 150 years, they would go into Babylonian captivity, but it would be a different situation that they would return from under prophecy by Jeremiah. But right now, God is protecting them in the southern kingdom not to have the same fate at the same time that the northern kingdom had. Back to 2 Kings, real quick. Then I'm going to read some things out of Hosea, and we'll be done. 2 Kings 18, verse 11 and 12. 2 Kings 18, 11 and 12. the king of Assyria exiled the Israelites to Assyria. This happened because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord their God, violated his covenant, all that Moses, a servant of the Lord, had commanded, and would neither listen nor obey. Hosea. The book of Hosea is for Israel kind of like the book of Lamentations is for Judah. Remember Jeremiah writing Lamentations after Judah was finally conquered by the Babylonians? Hosea is kind of like a lament for the northern kingdom. In chapter 4 of Hosea, it says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will forget your children." Chapter 5, verses 3 through 5, it says, "O Ephraim," another name for Israel, "you played the harlot. Israel has defiled itself. Their deeds will not allow them to return to their God." Your deeds can get so bad that you can't get back to God. You think we got some people like that in America? Our culture has gotten so bad that we don't know the way back to God. "For a spirit of harlotry is within them, and they do not know the Lord. Moreover, the pride of Israel testifies against him, and Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity." This is why it happened. Chapter 6, verses 10 and 11. "In the house of Israel I have seen a horrible thing. Ephraim's harlotry is there. Israel has a defiled heart." But here's a good thing. "Also, O Judah, there is a harvest appointment for you, when I restore the fortunes of my people." Hezekiah got to lead in that harvest. Now for chapter 8, this is back to Israel. Verses 5 through 9, "He's rejected your calf, O Samaria, capital of Israel, saying, my anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence?" Incapable of innocence. The hearts were so wicked, they don't even know innocence anymore. We're destroying innocence in every even our children. We're trying to destroy their innocence. "For from Israel is even this, a craftsman made it, so it is not God. Surely the calf of Samaria will be broken to pieces. For they sow the wind, they reap the whirlwind." That was written about Israel and what would happen to them under Assyria. "Israel is swallowed up. They are now among the nations like a vessel which no one delights. They have gone up to Assyria." Chapter 9, "They will not remain in the Lord's land, but Assyria will eat, and in Assyria they will eat unclean food." Verse 11 of chapter 9, "Their glory will fly away like a bird." And verse 17 of chapter 9, "My God will cast them away because they have not listened to him, and they will be wanderers among the nations." And finally, chapter 10, verse 11 and 12, "Judah will plow, Jacob will harrow for himself. Sow with a view to righteousness, reap in accordance with kindness. Break up your fallow ground. It's time to seek the Lord until he comes to rain righteousness on you." That's what Hezekiah is doing. He's breaking up that fallow ground. It's time to seek the Lord. You can see why he's such a great king. And next week, we're going to see the most amazing response of God to save a nation. Probably the most incredible response that God will bring in just a moment of time. So make sure you're here next week. Rain, snow, or wind, or earthquake, whatever. Make sure you're here next week. All right. Any